Okay, hello class. Good to see you today. Here we are. I do this at the beginning of each week, but this is week 14, I believe. So next week for this semester we're off, right? So it's Thanksgiving, and then we'll come back for a week, which will be week 15, and then last your final exam. Final show-off opportunity. I know you're probably getting tired of hearing that. Will be in week 16. So the end draweth near. We're getting there. I feel really good about what we've done in this course. I thought it important that we look at resource or factor markets as well as with product markets. Okay, so it's kind of easy to restrict our thinking when we're engaged in microeconomics, at least at this level, think only in terms of product markets, things that are exchanged at Walmart or at the restaurant, at least as far as a person coming in and buying something. But there's also resource markets at work in those places as well. Especially you can see it at the restaurant because there's someone selling their labor, okay? All right, and there's someone else supplying machinery or capital of some other form, a building and what have you. So you may have an El Chico's in this establishment here. Somebody else may own the building, and basically they're supplying that capital for some sort of return. The employee is looking for a wage. The suppliers of capital are looking for some sort of rent. Okay, so that's kind of the two terms we've been using here. With respect to resource or factor markets, we use those terms interchangeably. So we are in both markets as far as this chapter goes. Well, I got to be careful. We are. I want to make sure we understand what we mean by a perfectly competitive factor market. Okay, you know what a perfectly competitive resource or product market is. We've talked about that before. We'll go back and review that briefly here today because I want to draw a parallel between perfectly competitive product markets and perfectly competitive resource or factor markets. Now, this is one of those things where it's kind of good to make sure we have proper and precise definitions for the terms we're using. And so it occurred to me we might, since the last time we met, we might look at the glossary of your text just to make sure we understand what we're talking about. And so here, this is page G18, page 18 in your glossary. And I want to go to that for a minute here, if we can, radar here on the document camera. And you'll see here two terms. Okay, let's see. All right, now we've talked about perfect competition as far as a product market goes. That's a market structure in which there is a very large number of firms that sell a standardized product. I keep using what example? Wheat farmers, right? Wheat's wheat. Into which entry is very easy, in which the individual seller has no control over the product price, in which there is no non-price competition. No one says they're wheat special, right? It'd be weird to turn your TV on and hear an avocado farmer brag about their avocados, right? Or what have you, because those are very competitive markets that sell a standardized product. It's a market characterized by a very large number of buyers and sellers. In particular, the emphasis is on a large number of sellers. I'll tell you that. Also buyers as well. But I think I keep using this example. In my hometown growing up, there was only one grocery store. If there had been a lot of grocery store, many firms selling, it would have been what we would have recognized as a very competitive market. But I guess if you get too much of either, firms that are selling or people who are buying, then that gives them power over the price of the product that gets exchanged. So you can imagine a town with a few buyers and many sellers. Well, the buyers have all the power in that case, all right? So if you have a few firms, the firms have market power, the ability to raise the price If you have few buyers, then the buyers have the power to lower the price. Okay, they can bid the price down. Hope that makes sense. So kind of like in the NFL, okay, you know, you got all these teams that may be bidding for the Heisman Trophy winner, or few cream of the crop players. In that case, you know, it's not a very competitive market. The players can bid up the price. They're going to sell their labor at a high price. Okay, so there we're talking about kind of the next kind of market here. So we've gone from product market, when we talked about wheat and avocado farmers, to people who sell their labor or rent out their capital. Those are called factor markets. And in particular, the factor markets we're going to focus on in Chapter 16 for the most part now will be purely competitive, at least going forward today, purely competitive factor markets. Or here's a purely competitive labor market. It's a resource market in which there are many firms that compete with each other in hiring a specific kind of labor. Numerous equally qualified workers supply that labor, and no one controls the market wage rate. So the idea here with purely competitive labor markets is like with purely competitive product markets, no one has control of the price of whatever's being exchanged. In a labor market, it's labor. So there's a lot of firms, okay, so, you know, they have to compete for the labor that's being supplied, so they can't bid down the labor. But there's also a lot of sellers of labor as well. So in the case where there were a few sellers, like a few great football players, they could bid up the wage. But you don't have that case here. You've got many sellers of labor, many buyers of labor. So in either case, let me just make mention of this here just for a moment. We'll stay on the dot cam. I want to think about these two types of markets for a moment and talk about profit maximizing behaviors. I'm going to write a thing or two down here. Profit maximizing behavior. Whether you're talking about product markets or resource markets, let's see if I can get this on the camera here. There's a certain rule that these markets seem to try to follow, is that the marginal benefit of their actions need to equal the marginal cost. So if you're talking about a product market, okay, a product market, firms will produce, profit maximizing firm will produce. I'm just going to say firms here. I should have said that. Firms produce until the marginal revenue of their output equals the marginal cost. Okay, this is just general. This is true in any product market. It doesn't have to be competitive, perfectly competitive. We'll go back and apply this in perfect competition in a minute. In a resource market, like a labor market, capital markets, and so forth, you're going to hire. Firms will hire labor, capital, and so forth until what? Well, until the marginal revenue product equals the marginal resource cost. Okay, so we've looked at what the marginal revenue product is. We've looked at the definition. It's the change in total revenue divided by the change in units of labor or capital units employed. Okay, so we went through that chart. We'll can look at that here in a minute in determining the marginal revenue product. But at any rate, you hire an additional worker. Over here, you hire an additional worker as long as that worker adds more to your total revenue than to your total cost. I hope that makes sense. I hope you see that that's rational behavior. That's thinking on the margin. Okay, so if you got 100 workers and you're thinking about hiring one more, the 101st worker in this period of time, then you got to ask yourself, does that worker add more to revenue, the top line on the income statement, than the total cost that are associated with that worker? If so, then that would be a good buy. All right, now in perfect competition, okay, in perfect competition, you have these things that we've noted. And when you're talking about a perfectly competitive product market, recall that the price of output, okay, the price of the output for an individual is equal to the marginal revenue of the output. Remember that individual demand curve, okay, was horizontal. That means that the price of output is set in the marketplace, and the individual wheat farmer or whoever has to accept that price. In other words, the firm is a price taker, okay? The firm is a price taker, okay, when you're talking about perfectly competitive product markets. So if that's the case, if price of output equals the marginal revenue of output, then you're going to produce until the price of the output equals the marginal cost. Okay, so you're going to produce and sell. So produce and sell output until when? Okay. Well, you substitute price for marginal revenue here until the price equals the marginal cost. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So remember our diagrams we had. This is just kind of a rough diagram. I know this is back there in review, but you have a supply and demand curve in the product market. This is the product market here. And at whatever price those two equilibrate, sets a price that is also the individual demand or marginal revenue curve for the individual supplier. Marginal cost curve goes up like this. So we've talked about you want to sell a quantity, produce and sell a quantity of output. I'm going to use a little q here. Sorry. Still, I'm trying to get over my cold. A little quantity of output because here we're looking at the individual supplier. Okay, that makes sense there. Okay, now let's go over here to the resource market for a second. Okay, now in perfect competition, when we talk about pure or perfect, I prefer to use the term perfect competition. We saw that both firms, or the buyers of the resource and the sellers, both buyers and sellers are price takers. Okay, so a firm is a price or wage taker. They have to accept the wage that's determined in the labor market. Okay, so the firm is a wage or rent taker, depending on whether we're talking about the market for labor or for capital. Okay, so at any rate, then we can say the following here, that the price of the resource, instead of the price over here, the output, I'm going to write the price of the resource is equal to the marginal resource cost. Okay, this is the marginal resource. I'm going to write the word resource again here. Marginal resource cost. So you're going to hire until not only this is satisfied up here, but if you're in a perfectly competitive resource market, then you're going to hire until the price of the resource here equals its marginal revenue product. Hire until the marginal revenue product of the resource equals the price of the resource. Can you read my writing? Doesn't matter what the resource is. If you're profit maximizing, okay, then you're going to equate marginal revenue product of labor to the price of labor. Marginal revenue product of capital is going to equal the price of capital. And these are things that you don't have any control over as a firm. But you do have a control over the amount of labor you hire, how many workers, or how many units of capital, how many machines you rent. You're going to hire those factors of production until they fall to these levels. Remember, marginal revenue product falls like marginal product falls. Certainly in the short run, these things are going to fall. And this is, you're going to hire these to what? Maximize profit. So you have what we will look at here in a minute. Hopefully you've had time to read your chapter here. I'm just kind of giving you a look ahead. But on page, this is on page 333. I write in my book a lot, so just ignore my handwriting here. But they give you here to maximize profit. Okay, you get this rule. It's called the profit maximizing rule for resource markets. Higher labor and higher capital until the marginal revenue product of these two factors fall to equal their price. And if they're equal, then these fractions are both equal to 1. Okay? So this is called the profit maximizing rule. We'll be using this here today before we're done. The profit maximizing rule. Okay, they also have something called the least cost rule we'll look at here in a minute. Okay, I'm giving you a look ahead. Now you may say, well, that I see the parallels there and so forth. Draw me a graph, Dr. J. Well, they give you one of these. This is a look ahead in the next chapter. This is chapter 17. We drew a picture here, a graph for product markets. You have the market and then you have the individual supplier. Okay? That should look familiar. Now on page 344 of your text, you got this thing right here that applies to the market for a resource like labor. It also has a supply and demand curve because we're in a perfectly competitive situation. Wherever these two intersects, that sets a wage rate that the individual firm, the one who hires labor or capital, say labor has to accept as the wage. Okay? If it's capital, it's rent. So those are things beyond their control. So a firm has to pay the prevailing wage, the wage that prevails in the labor market. Or if they want to rent money or to rent a machine, okay, in other words, how do you rent money? You borrow money at the bank, okay, or you sell bonds, however you ultimately rent equipment, you got to pay whatever the rental rate is that prevails in the capital market, okay? Because you see this over here for the individual firm. Again, we're in perfect competition. This firm is one of many. They accept the wage, which is the price of labor in the labor market. It's called the wage. They accept that as a given. They have no control over that. They are a wage taker, if you will, this individual firm. So this line right here tells you the price they have to pay for each unit of labor. It's going to be the same. However, you do have a downward sloping marginal revenue product curve. Marginal revenue product curve. This is telling you again the additional revenue supplied by an additional worker, okay? Or the additional revenue that's supplied by an additional unit of capital, maybe a machine for the week or the month or what have you. And it's decreasing, as we've seen, okay, in this chapter with these examples. Let's go back here. We looked at this example here on page 323 of your text. Okay, and this is the demand for labor in a purely, when you have pure competition in the sale of a product. Notice the product price, pure competition in the sale of a product. So you have a perfectly competitive product market here. That's going to, for a typical firm, establish a marginal revenue product curve over here that's downward sloping. So we constructed a table. I gave you a table when we did this. I'll show it to you on the next one. I couldn't find this one. We wrote this one in class. But anyway, here it is. You'll see the marginal revenue product is the change in total product, total revenue, okay, divided by the change in the resource. A little review there, okay? So 14 minus 0 over 1 minus 0 is 14. Total revenue here is $12 change. That's the change in total revenue. That would be the marginal revenue on the second worker. So that second worker is going to provide a marginal revenue product of $12. Another way of doing that, another way of obtaining the marginal revenue product is not by simply using the definition, which we are here. Okay, I'm going to write in my book. In fact, they tell you down here what it is. But it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in the resource quantity. Resource quantity, okay? Sorry. I mean, that's what they're telling you in words down here. Okay? Another way of obtaining the marginal revenue product, though, is always to take the marginal revenue and multiply by the marginal product. Now, we did this with a little more precision when we looked at the next example in your book, okay, where you're looking at, should be obvious that this one right here is the demand for labor in an imperfectly competitive product market. How can we tell that that is an imperfectly competitive product market? Now, I thought I brought this. Oh, here it is. You got it. You nailed it. That's exactly right. So the product price goes down. So this is an imperfectly competitive product market. So the price of output here. So, and I've put this up for you guys on Blackboard for you to use. So if you want to, kind of adjusted this a little bit. It's a little offset by half a unit from their approach in your text. Some books will present it this way. It's just a lot easier to see. Okay, it's easy to get confused when you have these staggered quantities here. Really, that marginal product here applies to the the 3.5 unit 3.5 a unit of output. So it's kind of an average over this range. But at any rate, I say it's an average. It kind of applies to the midpoint, extended over the range. But here, I'm making use of another way. This lends itself well to another way of calculating the marginal revenue product. So we're just using the left-hand side of this thing here for the next example. As you noted, it was an imperfectly competitive product market. This is table 16.2. The product price is going down. Okay, so I'll just kind of transcribe all that over here in this table. And we're able to get the marginal revenue product here by taking the marginal product and the price of the output. This would be, well, you'd have to find the marginal revenue, and you multiply across here. So this is a perfectly competitive in the factor market. But at any rate, you can, let's use the definition again. You can take the total revenue, which is output product times the price, gives you total revenue. Total revenue from the first employer is $18.20. Okay. They're producing 7 units of output. Here's the price. 7 times the price is this. That's the total revenue. A change in total revenue divided by the change in the, over here, by this change in the quantity of labor is going to give you $13, okay? So you go from here to here, that numerator is $13. Change in total revenue divided by the quantity is change in one worker, $13. So that's the marginal revenue product. And there again, we're using this definition that's on page 323 of your text. Okay, change in total revenue divided by the change in the resource quantity. I hope that kind of makes sense, okay? All right. At any rate, this isn't for an imperfectly competitive product market, because again, these prices go down. You should be able to complete this table. You should be able to compute the marginal revenue product curve over here, and then you should be able to tell me how many units of labor, that is, how many workers would this firm hire at a given wage rate. So if the wage rate is $6 a worker, you'd hire 3 workers, right? Because $6 puts you right here between these two numbers. That 6th worker will increase the total revenue by $8.40, and they cost you $6, so that's a good buy. You wouldn't want the 4th worker. So again, what we're doing here and what you're going to see in these problems is that the marginal revenue product decreases whether or not you're in a perfectly or imperfectly competitive product market. These numbers are going to go down. So in the previous example, all these that were the same price, the price of the product, because you were in a perfectly competitive product market. If these all said $2, you're still going to have these going down over here, okay? These numbers would go down. So it just doesn't matter, okay? So we saw that in the previous example here, okay? Where again you take the marginal product times the price over here, which is the marginal revenue, and you got the marginal revenue product here. So these numbers go down, as we've seen. In the short run, marginal product's got to go down. So regardless of whether the product price goes down or not, marginal revenue product's got to go down. So the labor demand curve is a downward sloping curve. I call this the labor demand curve. This is the labor demand curve. They got a D here, is the marginal revenue product curve. Now there's a lot of moving parts there, right? Any questions on this? There's a lot of moving parts. All right, so what we're saying is that in general, the labor demand is the product of the marginal revenue product. So labor demand is the marginal revenue product curve, as you saw in that diagram just a moment ago. And I said one way to compute that is to take the marginal revenue and multiply by the marginal price, marginal product, whatever that. Now, in a perfectly competitive resource market, the marginal revenue is the price of the output. All right, now I want to focus on this a second. We looked at this a little bit last time, but we said anything that increases either of these things right here will increase this. That is, you can increase the demand for labor. Okay, you can increase the demand for, say, labor through either increasing marginal revenue of labor or the marginal product. Okay, the marginal revenue or the marginal product. So that's, when we talk about increasing the demand for labor, we're not saying increasing the quantity demanded for labor. We're talking instead about shifting the labor demand curve. What are things that would, in this framework of the price of labor, which is also called the wage, okay, would shift to a higher quantity of labor employed. So if you're going to increase the demand for labor, then there would be a right shift in the demand curve. And those things that will shift a demand curve or supply curve we used earlier in the course are called determinants. Okay, so it's these determinants that will affect the position of the demand curve. All right, and so we began looking at these last time, things that shift. So these are the shifters, if you will. Okay, the shifters. So on page, let me pull this up here. This is page, I think 326. We looked at the determinants, okay, right here, of resource demand. So you want to spend some time with that, okay? So we looked at this last time. And so this is a little reprise, just real quickly. We talked about changes in product demand. Okay? So if there's a greater demand for for cell phones, just say for cell phones, greater demand for cell phones. How would that affect, now I'm talking about that's the product, cell phones, the product. So something's happened in the product market, cell phones, greater demand for cell phones. How would that affect the demand for cell phone assemblers, which is a resource? Okay, would it increase the demand for assemblers or decrease? What do you think? What's your common sense say? There's more. Everybody wants a cell phone now. I've seen that in my lifetime. Now everybody goes, kids have cell phones, right? But everybody wants that cell phone. I don't want a flip phone anymore. I want an iPhone, what have you. Whatever the new gadget is, everybody wants one of those. What's going on over here in the market for labor? So here we're looking at the market. Could be also for the individual, okay? Individual supplier, what have you. But what's happening to the demand for cell phone assemblers? It's going, okay, yeah, it's going up, obviously. So if there's changes in the product demand, then that's going to increase the resource, okay? What about, and so we looked at that last time. The second one they mentioned here. So a lot of this that you'll have on this last test, I hope you can kind of reason it out. It's not really that difficult. We looked at changes in productivity, okay? So what if labor's more productive? Changes in productivity. Okay? Changes in productivity. Well, if you have an increase in the productivity of labor, maybe for a number of reasons, they list 3 reasons why that might happen. Okay, we'll go back through these here in a second just to make sure we got this. But if labor is more productive, then the marginal product of labor you're going to see is increases. Okay, each worker adds more product when they're hired. So this is going to go up, and so this will go up. So if there's an increase in productivity of labor, that also is going to shift to the right the demand for labor, that resource. If labor is more productive, whatever makes labor more productive, okay, through the marginal product curve here is going to increase the marginal revenue product curve, okay? And so they mentioned these 3 things, and we went through these last time, so I don't want to go through them again. I just want to mention that if each worker has more resources to work with, that is more machinery, that is to say there's a higher, say, capital labor ratio, then the workers are more productive. So you give them some machinery, wow. Or if you give them better machinery, okay, more advanced machinery to work with, that's going to make your workers more productive, okay? All right, so these things here. And then if you feed them better, okay, the quality of the variable resource itself. So we're talking about here the quality of the labor itself. So you feed them better, you train them, okay? Better fed, better trained workers are going to, each worker is going to exhibit a higher marginal product. And so if that's kind of the case across the board, then expect the demand for those kind of workers to increase. Hope that makes sense. And now in the United States, say we have high demand for workers in certain sectors because there's a lot of other resources for them to work with. There's a lot of capital to work with and so forth. So that a lot of machinery, if you got a lot of machinery for your typical farm worker to work with, there's going to be a great demand for those farm workers. Farm workers are going to make more money in the U.S. than they would elsewhere. They have more machinery. Also, they are scarcer relative to the machinery that's available. So, that's kind of another way of looking at it. The labor is scarcer in the United States relative to the capital that's in the workplace. So, again, that makes the labor you have more productive. All right. So we got through those last time, those 3 determinants. Or I guess there's 2. Changes in product demand, changes in productivity. Kind of a recap. I guess I don't mean. But at any rate, here's the 3rd one today. I want to mention this here. Is, let's see. I wonder if I could go to let me look here just real quick. Before we go on, let me go to the PowerPoint if we can, Radar. I just got a nice slide here. I put these up for y'all. So, okay, this one right here. So now we're slide 2 of 2. So this is where we left off last time. So the changes in prices of other resources. Okay, that's the top thing you'll see on page 328. So what I mean by that, the price of capital is going to affect the demand for labor. Okay? So there's situations, say, where capital and labor are substitutes, and there's situations in which they're complements. So you got to keep this straight. You got to look at the particular environment, the production environment, and you got to ask yourself, okay, is the employer trying to answer this question? Should I hire machines or workers? Okay? Or how many workers should I hire with my machines? Okay? So the two can compete with each other, or they can work with each other. Does that make sense? It doesn't, for instance, you can, pardon me, you can replace, well, this morning my wife and I were talking about it. She just mentioned this and said, that's a great example. But she's talking about how now with artificial intelligence, there's people who get degrees in reading, like, and I'm not, you'll have to forgive me for my ignorance in the field, but they're reading not necessarily just x-rays, but they're reading MRI imagery and all this imagery, you know, that's produced in the medical place, in the doctor's office. They're reading it. It's always been a human to look at this, okay? Now, since artificial intelligence is so sophisticated, and there's been a rise in the advance in artificial intelligence of late, you can replace a lot of those workers with a computer. So there's people who are saying, oh, I got this degree in medical imaging or whatever it's called, and alas, I guess I'm going to have to go work at McDonald's or something like that. That's what she said. I said, well, that's interesting, because in that case, in that environment, machines and labor are substitutes for each other. So there's instances where you got substitutes, okay? And then, of course, there are instances where if you got the machine, you got to have a worker to operate the machine. It's that tractor. Now, we will have self-driving tractors here pretty soon, probably, and all that. But up to this point, you needed someone sitting in the seat of that farmall to drive the farmall back and forth and plow the field. So you see the difference here, the distinction I'm trying to make, okay? There are instances where capital and labor are substitutes for each other, and there are instances where they're complement. You got, and in particular, we're going to assume where they're complements, that they're used in what's called fixed proportions, okay? So you got one worker per tractor, okay? But you might have two workers for another machine that does something else, okay, and so forth. That it takes two people to operate this machine over here. And that's called fixed proportions. So if you got fixed proportions dominating the production environment, then your two inputs are complements, and they have to be used in that way. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to think about this just a little bit. All right, so let's talk about how the change in the price of other resources, say capital, will affect the demand for labor. So you first have this the change in the price of substitute resources. So if the price of machinery goes down, the rental rate of machinery goes down, okay? All right, so you can use labor or machinery. I use the word or, that's the conjunction there. It's actually a disjunction, right? And it's an exclusive disjunction. It's not like I can eat peanut butter or jelly, which means you can eat both. No, one or the other, but not both. Okay, so I'm getting a little technical there. But you use machinery or labor. So what was my example again? What did I just say? But at any rate, gosh, I thought I had a good example. But at any rate, so you use one or the other. So if the price of the machinery goes down, what are you apt to do as an employer? Are you going to hire more workers or fire? Well, there's this first thing called a substitution effect. Okay, so if you hire one or the other, the substitution effect says you're going to hire the cheaper resource. So the cheaper one resource becomes relative to the other, the more that you're going to hire. So as the price of machinery goes down, then you're going to substitute machinery for labor. Okay, this is called the substitution effect. And I've marked up my book here, but let's just look at this. This applies to substitute resources. Can we go to this radar? Okay. Here we go. Oh, thank you very, very much. There's all my writing in here, but when we're talking about substitute resources, which is, you have two effects you got to consider. The first is called the substitution effect. And it basically means the employer is going to gravitate to the relatively cheaper resource, more so as it becomes relatively cheaper. So a change in the quantity demanded of a consumer good that results from a change in its relative expensiveness caused by a change in the good's own price, okay, is going to exhibit what's called the substitution effect. Okay, so firms say substitute machinery for labor when the price of machinery falls relative to the price of labor. I'm just going to write it that way, okay? There's a lot of words there, but let me write it this way, okay? So we're still under the doc chem, and so we're talking about this other determinant. Again, we're on determinants. So we're talking about the price of other resources, okay? And those other resources can be either substitutes or complements, depending on the work environment, if you will. Substitutes or complements. We'll get to substitutes in a minute. So this first effect is called the substitution effect. It basically says hire more capital, say, when the price of capital falls relative to labor. Sorry for my writing. I was going to kind of do this differently, but this seemed, sorry about this. When I watch this, I go, all right, when are you going to move the camera? Okay, can y'all read my writing? Hire more capital when the price of capital falls relative to labor, because it becomes cheaper, relatively speaking. Okay. All right. That's called substitution. But there's another effect that applies for substitutes, not for, it also will for complements, but you have the substitution effect only for substitutes. We're going to see in a minute. You have the output effect. All right, when the price of capital falls, you're also going to hire more labor. All right, so when the price of capital falls, okay, it becomes more profitable to produce greater output. Maybe your factory here has been producing 10 cars a day, but you got a metal stamping machine or something. That's a lot cheaper. So now it's more profitable to produce every level of output. In particular, you might produce 12 cars a day instead of 10. So if the price of capital falls, it becomes more profitable to produce greater output. So the firm hires more labor. Okay? If the machinery is a lot cheaper now to rent than it was before, then maybe machinery competes with labor. But if it becomes markedly less expensive or to use machinery, then you're going to produce more output, becomes more profitable to double your output, say. And if you're going to do that, you wind up hiring more workers. Does that make sense? That can happen. All right? That's called the output effect. So you have both effects that work through substitutes. And so what's the net effect? For substitutes. Okay? The demand for labor can go up or down. Demand for labor will go up if the output effect is greater than the substitution effect. So the demand for labor increases if the output effect here is greater than the substitution effect. Just reason it out. Don't memorize anything. Just reason it out. So if you understand what these two effects are, the substitution effect says you replace one resource with the relatively cheaper resource. Okay, so if the price of capital falls, you're going to buy more machinery and lay off workers. Okay? But if the price of machinery has fallen enough that it's more productive to produce more output, then you may wind up hiring more workers because you still need workers to produce the greater level of output. So the demand for labor would increase if the output effect here is greater than the substitution effect. Does that make sense? Okay. That's the net effect. So you got the price of other resources, and these other resources can be substitutes. So there's substitutes. And then there are complements. We should put two circles around these. I don't know. Complements. So your book talks about this a little bit at the bottom of the page. These go together, and as I say, we're going to assume fixed proportions. So you need two operators always for that lens grinding machine or whatever it is. It won't work by itself. Right now, fortunately, steel freight trucks on the road are used in fixed proportions with drivers for the most part. We haven't moved to driverless trucks yet. Probably will. You're going to be in this environment. Well, oh, okay. You can replace drivers with trucks that have onboard technology that drive themselves. But I hope we're not there anytime soon because I don't want to get out on the road with these things. Right now, you got to have one worker per truck. Fixed proportion, 1 for 1. Fixed proportion is like you got to have a right shoe for every left shoe. Okay. So that's the assumption here when we talk about complements. And with complements, you don't have a substitution effect. Hope it makes sense. There's no substitution effect because of fixed proportion. There is only an output effect, okay? So there's an output effect. So let's think about that just a sec. Again, just use your reasoning. I don't want you to memorize the chart or anything. But if the price of capital falls, let's just use an example. Price of capital falls. How would that affect the demand for labor? If labor and capital are used in fixed proportions, what do you think? The price of trucks go down. Is there going to be an increase or decrease demand for truck drivers in the current environment? We're not in the Jetson age yet. We're going to need more truck drivers or fewer? What do you think, class? Okay, yeah. If the price of capital falls, that's going to then this increases the demand for labor. Okay. If the price of capital increases, that would decrease the demand for labor. So you should be able to reverse each one I'm talking about here. Okay. Just reason it out. Make sure you understand what the other resource is. Is it a complement or substitute? And here you have only an output effect. There is no substitution effect. Substitution effect, I'm going to just say none. Okay, there's not one. None. So they're telling you some things here that also should make sense for the demand of a product, well, the labor demand curve here. Things, again, they summarize this perhaps in a little different way. but they do this for you in your text at the bottom of page 328. The demand for and therefore the price of the product, if that increases, that would increase the demand for labor. The productivity of labor, if that increases, that would increase the labor demand curve. We'll shift rightward, okay? When we say increasing the labor demand curve, I hope you see what would cause that curve to shift rightward? Well, the productivity of labor increases. The price of a substitute input decreases provided the output effect exceeds the substitution effect. The price of a substitute input increases, like capital, if it goes up, provided the substitution effect exceeds the output effect. So if you have trouble remembering, you just use capital and labor in your mind. So if the price of capital goes up, and capital is a substitute for labor, then there's going to be an increase in the demand for labor. Or if the price of a complementary input decreases, okay, so you're talking about fixed proportions, so the price of a tractor goes down, farmers are going to want more tractors, but guess what? If they want more tractors, they want people driving those tractors. So I hope that makes sense. If you got this, if you just understand it at the intuitive level, I'm happy, okay? In fact, I'm the happiest, because I would just as soon you didn't say, oh, I got to memorize this chart here for the exam, okay? Which they spell it out again in this chart, but to me that's not understanding. If you have to memorize something, generally that means you haven't understood it. Maybe it's the old math teacher in me, but you want to get this kind of at the intuitive level. So it's not rocket science. It's not that difficult. Actually, you have quite a bit of intuition for this sort of thing, but we're just applying some structure now to this, something perhaps you can already intuit. Okay, so there's lots of things that are affecting the demand for employment in these various markets. So there's quite a bit here in your book about occupational employment trends, okay? The demand for service occupation seems to be outpacing manufacturing, construction, and mining occupations. I wrote myself a note over this. You'll get this over here. Kind of what you can steal out of this, the fastest growing occupations, and I hope it's okay that I'm kind of pointing to the book here. I want you to read your book. But service occupations seem to be growing more in their demand than manufacturing, construction, and mining. In particular, like nurse practitioners. Now, some of these make sense in the current environment. Most of them do, but a few, I'll tell you, they kind of defy logic. But at any rate, the trend's going one way. Why might you think, though? I mean, there seems to be, in fact, they back it up with data over here. On the next page, they list the 10 fastest growing U.S. occupations in percentage terms, and they got nurse practitioners here. Now, it's not the fastest growing percentage-wise, but numbers-wise, wow, because look, there's a bunch of them, LPNs and so forth, licensed practicing nurses. There's a bunch of those, and increasing. It looks like there's like over a 50% increase projected in this decade. So your book's a little dated, okay? So that's a very significant trend here. Why might that be? What do you think, class? I mean, I got an idea. Yours might be different and better than mine. I don't know. Okay? Well, I'll tell you one thing. I belong to a generation called the baby boomers, and we ain't getting any younger. Okay? I'm at the tail end of the baby boomers, actually. So I'm not as old as my mother, who is also, I think, a baby boomer. No, she wouldn't be. It's 15 years, so she's 20 years. My mother's only 19 years older than I am. So she was a young thing when I was born. She's the greatest generation or something. The generation 4, I forget what it's called. But anyway, as baby boomers age, guess what? We need more help, okay? So if you want to put your money in something that's going to grow in the next few years, not only nursing homes and so forth, but alas, probably funeral services, because we seem to be dropping off the planet a little bit. So you can look at those demographic trends and so forth and kind of project where some of these markets are going. I don't know what the story here is with motion picture projectionists, okay? Wind turbine service technicians, okay? And a lot of this is driven by whatever administration's in office and whatever the policies are being advanced by the federal government. So as of the writing of this book, it looked like, there was going to be a great construction boom here for wind turbines. So my wife and I drove across the Texas Panhandle this summer, went out to Santa Fe, and there must be 10,000 of those wind turbines out in the Panhandle. I couldn't believe it, just so many. So you need technicians, okay, that service those and so forth. I don't know. You might be some other explanation here for cooks. Seem to be restaurant cooks and so forth seem to be growing. So the trend toward eating out more and so forth. And then there's these 10 most rapidly declining U.S. occupations. Now, some of this makes sense too, given, say, word processors and typists. Okay. Why? Voice activated technology or whatever you call it, voice transcription and technology. I mean, you don't have, you can speak and it types. And I worked in that in its infancy, that's how old I am. But I remember working with a company in Baltimore many years ago, and it was kind of cool, it could speak into the mic and it types. Back then that was kind of, had to make a voice print back there, so it wouldn't recognize anybody's voice. It had to recognize mine, so say different phonics and sounds to it. Makes these prints, and then it can understand you a little bit. Now Siri can understand anyone, right, or what have you. So there's a decrease in this. I remember my dear wife, she passed away, but she was an expert in shorthand. She had learned it in high school. She was an expert in shorthand, and she could write it forward and backwards. Okay, and I was, she just do this stuff. I thought that was pretty amazing, and there was a demand for that at one time. Now that no one uses shorthand, there was that Gregg shorthand book, and all that. No one. It's a lost art. No one needs it. It's gone the way that perhaps in the last. X-ray technician, people who read these photos I was just talking about, they may go the way of the blacksmith and the wheelwright as well. I don't know. It's just the way progress leads things over time. Okay. All right. So enough of this. What we've talked here in the last 45 minutes. Don't mean to drag this out, but it's worth thinking about. What increases and decreases the demand for a resource, in particular labor? What shifts the demand curve for labor? Demand for labor. We're talking about a resource market. Now I want us to talk about changing the quantity of labor demanded and so forth. So here we're going to look at the elasticity of labor demand. And just as we had product elasticities, we have resource elasticities. So we talked about the price elasticity of a product demand. Here we're going to talk about the price or wage elasticity of labor demand and labor supply, but in particular labor demand here today by looking at the slope of that marginal revenue product curve. Okay, the demand for labor curve is the marginal revenue product curve. So again, there's a definition that should be similar. It should look analogous to what we looked at before with product markets. Let's see, Radar, can we just look at this just a second on page 331? Thank you very much. She is great, Radar. The elasticity of resource demand. Okay, it's the percentage change in the quantity of the resource demanded divided by the percentage change in the resource price. Does that kind of look familiar? But we were looking at product demand divided by product price. Here we're looking at resource demand over resource price. So your book talks about different things that will affect this. Okay? Now, before we look at these things that affect the elasticity of resource demand, let's think of maybe two occupations that would differ in great respect along these lines. In fact, your book uses an example here. I think they talk about customer service representatives. Okay, it's becoming increasingly the case where, you know, if you're having trouble with your computer or something, your new Roku television, whenever you get on the phone, you call customer service, you might not be talking to a human being, right? You might be talking to a machine. And then eventually maybe you'll talk to a human being. But when you're talking about customer service representatives, it's a very elastic market for their services. Very elastic, because they can be replaced by machinery, okay? All right, so if all the customer service representatives for a company clamored for a pay raise, maybe they're all working in Bangalore, India, I don't know, but they want a 20% pay raise, guess what? The firm that employs them will say, hey, let's just hire some machines. Very elastic, okay? The demand for their services is very sensitive to a percent change in their price. Does that make sense? Whereas there are other occupations that have not yet been replaced and probably will not be replaced by machinery anytime soon. So a brain surgeon, okay? Now they use machinery, but if I got to have brain or heart surgery, I still want, and I don't mind that person making a lot of money, I still want that surgeon. I want that MD there operating the machinery and so forth. So they can command whatever price that they want. So, you know, there's not a very high, or the demand for their services is not very responsive to a percent change in their price, their wage, if you will, their salary. Does that make sense? So there you're talking about a very price inelastic resource. Okay. All right, so what things affect the elasticity of resource demand? Let's just list these, okay? So I'll go in here. So now we're talking about elasticity of resource demand. That's our topic here. Sorry for all the writing here today. It's just where I am in my life, I guess. So we're all at different places. There we go. Elasticity of resource demand. So what we're saying here is this E sub RD, elasticity of resource demand, is the percent change in the resource demanded divided by a percent change in the price of the resource, or resource price. Okay, so some items like call center operators and so forth, their demand is very responsive to a change in price, but some things like some laborers like brain surgeons, they're not, what have you. Okay, now I'll tell you one here I'm learning more about is, you would think, okay, I'll call them just movie stars, motion picture personalities and so forth. It's going to get to where, I mean, these people have commanded high salary. If you're a star in Hollywood, wow, you're wealthy, beyond imagination perhaps. Tom Cruise, no telling, you know, how much he's worth. But they'll be producing movies pretty soon. They already are. Just use ChatGPT if you want. It'll write the whole movie line, and then it'll create the avatars or whatever, the imagery on screen, and you're watching perfectly what look like perfect individuals following a perfect script in a movie, and you'll be just as captivated by that as you are by any movie out there now. That is to say, again, this elasticity as it applies to movie stars is increasing over time. It's becoming a more price elastic market because of the rise of AI. That's just an example. But at any rate, what are the things that affect this, okay? These are affected by, okay, ease of resource substitutability. Resource substitutability. Sorry for all this, okay? But at any rate, in that case, it's becoming more easy to replace movie stars with computer-generated personalities. So we watch the news, and, you know, I'll date myself. I remember Walter Cronkite. Do y'all know who Walter Cronkite was? Never heard of him, really. He was the most famous man in America next to the president. He was the most famous. Everyone watched Walter Cronkite. CBS News. Everyone watched. And then there was, later came, well, there was Huntley Brinkley on NBC. Cronkite was on CBS. And if you want to go back and watch what happened on the day Kennedy was assassinated, John Kennedy, Walter Cronkite rocketed to prominence that day. He shed a tear, several, on the air that day in 1963. Anyway, everybody watched Walter Cronkite. Okay, now, the news can be reported by an individual that's completely computer generated. You won't even know it. Now, you guys know this better than I do. Okay, I'm just now like, wow, I'm catching up with this. But my wife and I, we watch a lot of YouTube. We don't watch, or at least I watch, she just sits there and watches it with me. I always watch TV for information. I never watch it really for entertainment. But, and I'm a bit of a political junkie. But I'm watching what looks like, what sounds like Elon Musk. All these videos out there. But it looks like him, it sounds like him, but it's not him, right? So he could be reporting the news. Anyone could be reporting the news today. Someone at their laptop can create a personality that goes viral, and that's how news is pumped out there today and so forth. And some of it may be good, and some of it may not be so good. All that's to say there's more substitutes now for that personality. When I was growing up, there was only one Walter Cronkite. Okay? But now there's many, many substitutes. So the price elasticity of demand for that particular labor resource is much higher. Okay? How about this one? The elasticity of product demand. Elasticity of the product demand. Okay? It turns out that the greater the price elasticity of the product demand, the greater the elasticity of the resource demand. I think this one we got it, right? More substitutes, more elastic, okay? More substitutes, more elastic. Here, the greater the elasticity of the product, the greater the elasticity of the resource, okay? So, if assemblers, whatever this is for a particular device, if their wage goes up a little bit, let's just say their wage falls. The wage, so you got people who assemble laptop computers, okay, and their wage falls a little bit. So let's just assume, here's an example, wage of assemblers falls. Well, then that's going to have an effect on the supply of the product. The supply of product increases. So here's a numerical value here. The wage, dollars per hour, of assemblers fall. Then the supply of a product increases. Now you knew that already because labor is an input. And whenever you have an input in a product market and the price of that input goes down, the supply shifts to the right. Now that's going to have an effect on the demand for the product. So now we're shifting over to the product market. And the effect it has on the quantity demanded of the product depends on the elasticity of demand for that product. The elasticity of product demand will determine basically whether the product demand is a vertical or more or less a horizontal curve. Okay, so again, we're looking in the product market. Let's just assume that this is a very elastic product, price elastic product. So I drew the demand like this. So wage of assemblers falls. That means it's cheaper to produce output. This product market experiences an increase in supply, and that generates a market shift in the quantity demanded of the product. All right? So now go back to the factor market again. We started with the factor market. We said there's a wage increase. That's the price of a factor went down. That shifts the supply of product in the product market. and it consequently increases the quantity demanded for the product. So now how's that going to affect the demand for labor in the resource market? Okay, all right. Well, let's think about this a second. If buyers want to buy more flat screens, you got to have more workers, don't you? Got to have more workers. So the result is there's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded. Okay, increase in the quantity demanded of labor. If the wage of assembly workers falls, then through the product market, there's a marked increase in the quantity demanded of labor. Okay, a big increase. I'm just going to say big increase. There's a big increase in the quantity demanded of labor because there's a big increase in the supply of the product they produce. So in that case, labor is very elastic. Okay? In other words, we're talking about how the elasticity of a resource like labor is demanded. The elasticity of labor demanded is affected by the product market. If the product market has a very elastic demand, okay, it's very sensitive to a change in the price of the product, guess what? The quantity of labor that's hired is very sensitive to a change in the wage. There's a linkage there. There's like 2 or 3 things you got to link together. Cause and effect, okay? Okay, so it's a little harder concept perhaps, but if the wage goes up, in this case the wage went down the way I did. So if the wage goes down, increase in supply of the product. Increase in supply means there's an increase in the quantity demanded of the product. Increase in the quantity demanded of the product means there's an increase in the quantity demanded of the labor to make that product. Okay, so the result is that the labor is very elastic in that case. It's elastic when the product is elastic, has a high elasticity of demand. If the product has a low price elasticity of demand, then the labor to make that product is very price inelastic. Okay, wage inelastic. Just say inelastic. Okay, so the more elastic the product, the more elastic the resource. All that's to say, I boiled it down to those 4 or 5 words. More elastic the product, and what we mean by that is demand elasticity. But the more elastic the product, the more elastic the resource to make the product. Okay? So that's what they're saying in the middle of that paragraph when they say the greater the price elasticity of product demand, the greater the elasticity of resource demand. And then the last one here, the ratio of resource cost to total cost. Now this should look kind of familiar to us as well. I kept using table salt when I talked about price elasticity of demand for table salt, and that's a small part of your budget, you know, and so if the price of table salt doubles, you're still going to buy table salt, okay? Same sort of thing here, okay? The larger the proportion of total production cost accounted by a resource, the greater the elasticity of demand for that resource. So if something's really labor intensive, okay, it takes a lot of labor to make that whatever it is, then you're going to have a higher elasticity of demand for labor. Okay? Going to be a higher elasticity of demand. Just kind of, it's analogous to what we did before. Okay, it looks like I'm running out of time. That's what you said. So the larger the proportion of total production cost accounted for by labor, the greater the elasticity of demand for labor. Okay, so we're about out of time, just got a few seconds. I gave you, to begin with, the overview of where we're going to end in this chapter, probably will next time, where we're going to go back and we're going to look at what combinations of inputs, labor and capital, will maximize profit, which combinations will minimize the cost of producing any level of output. So we're going to talk about that, finish the chapter next time. But I gave you the overview, so you should be able to read through the rest of this chapter if you need to. Okay, see you next time.